Hello, today we're going to talk about different systems of government. We are going to begin with the unitary system, which is a government that gives all powers to the central government. State and local governments get their powers from the central government. This doesn't mean that there's one level of government. However, there's just one that's more centralized that kind of divvies out different powers. So examples of this would be Japan, France, and Bolivia. And looking at this diagram, you can kind of see how a unitary system works with the central government delegating powers out to the various states and local governments. A confederate system is a loose union of independent states. The United States was a confederacy under the Articles of Confederation. One of the biggest problems with this is there's a weak central government. They can't really enforce the decisions that they make. One strength of a confederate system is that the states actually have a lot of power. An example today would be the Federated States of Micronesia. Here's a diagram that shows you how a confederate system looks. The central government or the national government's in the middle with the surrounding states being connected and having more power than the national government. A federal system is a government that divides power between the national government as well as the state governments. Each level of government has its own sovereignty in some areas. The United States became a federal system under the new Constitution, and many countries today are federal systems. So some advantages would be there's a shared power among the different levels of government, and it's more centralized than a confederate system. So it kind of took a confederate system and really fixed one of the major weaknesses of that system. A disadvantage of a federal system is that each level can make its own laws. So maybe a state government makes a law that contradicts a federal law, and then that needs to be decided within the courts. So the United States, in looking at that, each state can have its own structure of government, whether it's a unitary structure, a confederate system, or a federal system. And looking at Maryland, it gives its counties more authority than most other states. So here's how a federal system looks. You can see you have the various governments, including local government, state government, and the national government. They all have their separate spheres, but they also all overlap in some capacity. This slide just shows you all three kind of compared to each other. And looking at those different systems, you also have different governments that are in place based off of those systems. So we've looked at the systems. Now we're going to look at different types of governments. So the first would be a constitutional government. And before getting into that, we need to explain what a constitution is. It's a plan that provides the rules for government. It has multiple purposes, including setting out the ideals that people are bound by the document or bound by the Constitution that they truly believe in and then they share. A Constitution also establishes a basic structure of government and defines what the government can and can't do. It also provides the supreme law for the land. Okay, it says that this is our law. Nothing else can be used to determine what is legal and what is illegal. A constitution can be written or unwritten. Most that you see will have been written, but Great Britain is one of the few exceptions. So in looking at constitutions, the U.S. has the oldest written constitution. It was written in 1786. Other countries like France, Kenya, India, Italy all have written constitutions. Great Britain, like I said, it has an unwritten constitution that's actually based off of hundreds of years of legislative acts, court decisions, and other customs. So now that we've defined a constitution, let's get into a constitutional government. A constitutional government is one which has a constitution that has authority and that is recognized by the people who govern. A constitutional government is a limited government. A country has a constitutional government when the government follows the Constitution. In looking at constitutions again, it's important to note that they are often incomplete. Okay, no written constitution can account for the future. Okay, the United States didn't spell out presidential term limits until after FDR was elected to the office of the president for 4 terms. A constitution also does not always reflect government practice. So this is where constitutional government, I guess this is where the idea that government must follow the Constitution for it to be a constitutional government. Because we can look at China, which describes, or their constitution describes the rights of citizens, but the government often refuses those rights. Okay, if you look at the internet and the news, it's often censored to reflect the views of the central government. Next up is an authoritarian government, or a government that controls all aspects of everybody's life. It's often referred to as a totalitarian government, or a system in which the government has total control. You can look at Hitler, Joseph Stalin as a couple of examples in the 1940s during World War II. With authoritarian governments, you have few political freedoms, including speech and assembly. Often the media is controlled by the government, and the government has the ability to use force to control people. And looking at Hitler and the Nazi Party, they were able to oppress various minorities, including the Jewish population, which eventually led to the Holocaust. Now, with authoritarian governments, you have really 2 types. You have dictatorships and oligarchies. So a dictatorship is a system in which the power is in control or in the hands of one person. So you think of Pol Pot in Cambodia or Adolf Hitler in Germany. An oligarchy is a system in which a small group holds power. So you can look at the Soviet Union. Okay, yes, Joseph Stalin was a dictator. However, you did have the Central Committee that also ruled with him and enforce different policies. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the different economic systems and kind of which government they're associated with. The first one we're going to talk about is socialism. It's where the government controls the basic means of production. They distribute products, wages, they provide social services such as healthcare, welfare, things like that. In a socialist economy, you are all going to have private businesses, but they're only going to be small businesses controlled by individuals. So maybe like Johnny's surf shop is controlled by Johnny, but the government is going to control the heavy industry and the main factors within the economy. It's developed, or socialism was developed because of industrialization. Capitalism led to unfair conditions and wages, and people wanted that change. And they believed that it would happen through revolution. Some believe that it would happen through peaceful terms. But these reformers wanted change. And in response to these reformers, people often argue that socialism has no form of motivation. So a doctor who does open heart surgery is making the same amount of money as the farmer who farms corn. And you have to ask, or the doctor would have to ask himself, why am I doing all of this? Why am I paying for this education or going through all of this training when I'm making the same amount of money as the farmer? You also have democratic socialism, which is socialism that's committed to democracy. So the government is involved in terms of distributing wealth, but they also want to maintain basic democratic freedoms. An example of this would be France in 2012. They elected a president from the Socialist Party and gained a majority in the French parliament. Communism is our next economic system. It's often called a command economy, in which the government controls all the factors of production. With pure communism, the state actually owns everything. Karl Marx is often seen as the founder of communism. He said you had 2 classes. You had the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were the people who owned the means of production. The proletariat were the workers who produced the actual goods. And Marx said that the workers would eventually revolt against the capitalists, and the goal would be socialism, but communism would actually be the end result. With communism, Marx said that there would actually be no need for government at all, which is kind of ironic because it is an economic system where there's total government control. In 1989 and 91, you had the fall of East Germany and the Soviet Union. After that, there really aren't many communist countries that still exist today. One major exception would actually be North Korea. Here you can kind of see socialism and communism. I know we haven't really talked about capitalism a whole lot yet, but we'll get to that in a second. But you can kind of see how wealth is distributed and what the economy looks like within these diagrams. Next up, you have a monarchy or a system of government in which a king or a queen or an emperor or an empress, they're going to have the supreme power over the government. A monarchy really originated in ancient times when rulers were seen as sacred. We talked about the divine right theory of government and how that was used to kind of justify their power. One example would be the Russian czars. So you have Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. But really, with an absolute monarchy, no one could kind of check the ruler's powers. You also have limited monarchies. So an example today would be Great Britain. Those are also called constitutional monarchies. It's where the king or the queen is limited by law. So here's the royal family before Meghan Markle. You also have democratic governments, including democracy. Okay? So this is where government is ruled by the people. Their powers derive from the consent of the governed. It comes from Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratia, meaning rule. And our first really example would be ancient Greece. With looking at that example, all people actually couldn't vote, only citizens could. Women, foreigners, and slaves were not considered citizens at the time. And then that eventually came back through the Enlightenment. Democracies can be representative or direct. A direct democracy is a government in which all citizens cast a vote directly on government issues and laws. This really only works in small societies because logistically it would be impossible in countries that have huge populations. Our government is a representative democracy where we elect representatives and then they give them the responsibility to make laws and conduct government. A republic is simply when a government in which voters hold sovereign power they elect representatives who are responsible to the people and then exercise that power. And within democratic governments, you have another economic system, which is called capitalism. It's a system that emphasizes private ownership of the factors of production, free choice, incentives. Pure capitalism has no government interference. Okay, the goal of capitalism is to create a free market or a system in which buyers and sellers make choices in the marketplace. And capitalism originated through the ideas of Adam Smith. He suggested the concept of laissez-faire, which was French for to let alone. It was a hands-off approach on government. And he believed that the forces of the marketplace would act as an invisible hand to guide the economy. Another idea of this, of Adam Smith, was the idea of competition, that competition would lead to the creation of better products as well as lower prices because people have to produce high quality goods and keep fair prices if they want consumers to keep buying their goods. Pure capitalism has 5 characteristics. You have private ownership, free enterprise, competition, freedom of choice, as well as the possibility of profits. Pure capitalism today really does not exist. You do have some government involvement, and that's going to lead to what is called a mixed economy. So, a mixed economy is just where the government regulates private enterprise. It combines some elements of capitalism as well as socialism. An example would be the United States. For example, there are restrictions in terms of hours you can work, um, as well as child labor laws and things like that. So, in looking at the U.S., the government played a small role in the economy until the beginning of the 1900s. The reason government involvement increased was because of the actual size of the government. Um, and with that government involvement, they decided to increase regulation. This is really in the progressive era. They focused on consumer health as well as product safety. And then the Great Depression actually required a massive amount of government involvement within the economy. So, hopefully, this kind of clarified things in terms of different types of government as well as the economies associated with each.